When old men plant trees in whose shade they know they will never sit, a society grows great. A Greek proverb from a time long before the problems of our modern economies, or the study of economics itself, is as true today as it was thousands of years ago. But, for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, successive generations are not becoming wealthier than their parents. While there have certainly been setbacks and historical outliers from this trend, it has remained true in aggregate for most developed economies' populations for a long time. It was simply assumed that people's children would have a better lifestyle in adulthood than they did. However, that is no longer the case. In fact, most young professionals can only aspire to live the lifestyles of their parents. Younger generations are finding it increasingly difficult to find stable employment, afford comfortable housing, start a family, and save for retirement. This is despite the fact that the world is far richer today than it was at any point in the 20th century when baby boomers were busy amassing their now unrivaled fortunes. So, what exactly is going on here? How can a world that is richer overall produce generations that are poorer than those who came before them? Is there an underlying reason for this? Is there a way to undo it if there is? And if there isn't, does that mean that every generation after that will be poorer than the one before it? And I suppose it's also worth asking, does this even matter since everyone will die and pass down their wealth in the end? Here's a question for you all. Is it preferable to be born into a large cohort with many people your age, or a small cohort with few people your age? According to conventional economic theory, a small cohort is preferable. On a macro level, it means less competition for jobs, housing, social programs, spots, and good schools. Natural resources, for example, face less competition. But how do you explain the baby boomers, who, despite being part of the world's largest population explosion, are affluent in aggregate? Lord David Willetts, a British politician, demographer, and author, suggests that the opposite is true, and that being part of a larger cohort is actually preferable in a democratic system because it gives that group more voting power on generational issues and more sway in marketplaces. When the boomers were young, they voted for policies that benefited them, such as low or no-cost higher education, family support systems, and strong social welfare systems. When they reached the pinnacle of their careers, their voting patterns shifted again, and this large group of voters was now in favor of lower income taxes, less business regulation, more domestic industry protections to avoid outsourcing and global competition, and, on a smaller scale, things like zoning laws to protect the value of their homes. Because only so many family homes could be built in the suburbs due to mandated single-family building requirements, houses grew in size and good locations became more desirable. In the 1950s, houses were essentially commodities. The majority of the cost was in the structure itself, and it wasn't uncommon for the family car to cost more than the family home. The boomers have begun to vote in support of retirement benefits, pension plans, medical infrastructure, and the elimination of wealth taxes, even if this comes at the expense of all the programs that served them well when they were young. Of course, David Willetts' work is primarily concerned with the United Kingdom. And, yes, I am aware that there are people who vote for the greater good rather than their own narrow self-interest. However, this trend can be seen over the last half-century on average. For example, in my home country of Australia, the 2019 federal election was largely decided by a policy decision that would reduce the tax effectiveness of Australian retirement accounts. The party that advocated for maintaining the favourable tax structure won primarily because of older Australian voters. We recently had another election in which the opposition party backed down on their plan to change retirement account taxes, which they wanted very convincingly. According to a 2017 British election study, votes for conservative parties have shifted over time from being divided by rich and working class, to being divided by young and old. Now, a lifetime of favorable government policy can be extremely beneficial to wealth creation. Consider how much better off the average millennial would be if they received free college or secondary schooling, all else being equal. This is the difference that many young people require in order to put down a deposit on a house, and it is the next major issue to consider when considering the housing divide. David Willetts' small cohort theory likely overlooks or undervalues an important detail that gave baby boomers an advantage over subsequent generations. And no, it's not just that they bought houses when they were cheap. That certainly didn't hurt, but it's more of a symptom of a larger problem. They were a large cohort in a small world. They had all of the voting power and almost no competition in the 1950s and 1960s. The global population was roughly a third of what it is today, and not to start a whole thing here, but if you were a white man in the countries that were mostly focusing on, your competition was even less severe. So, in addition to the obvious trade-offs that we discussed earlier, there was less competition for basically everything, including jobs, because employers had a smaller pool of labor to choose from. Labor force participation among women was very low, further reducing supply and thus worker bargaining power. However, it also meant that domestic duties were usually handled, which reduced household expenditures on things like childcare, food, and general upkeep. Because of these higher relative incomes, combined with lower outgoings, houses could frequently be paid off with as little as 1 year's income. Yes, they had to deal with higher interest rates, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, when home buying was at its peak, but it didn't make as much of a difference as it does today. In 1985, the median home price in the United States was $82,000. That is the mean. So 50% of homes, such as those sought after by first-time buyers, would be less expensive than this. Yes, but let's keep it simple and stick with $82,000, which becomes $103,000 when adjusted for median household incomes. At the time, the average mortgage rate was 15%, or about $15,000 per year. It did rise in some years, but most borrowers were locked in at an absolute maximum of about 15%. So, in the worst-case scenario, the median home today costs $430,000, and the average interest rate is just over 5%, amounting to $21,500 in annual interest payments. Again, this is adjusted for current median incomes. On the surface, these appear to be fairly comparable. Perhaps the younger generations should not be complaining about the high cost of housing. Many people dismiss this comparison by claiming that inflation was extremely high at the time. So these higher interest repayments were meaningless, but that's not true. In 1985, inflation was 3.5%, and while it reached 13.5% in 1980, this was consumer price index inflation, not housing inflation. Throughout these decades, house prices increased at a relatively slow pace. Everything else was becoming prohibitively expensive. This is the polar opposite of what we would expect today, where house price growth outpaces inflation, but it was not the case in the 1970s and 1980s. So, yeah, the inflation argument isn't entirely valid. Is it fair to complain about how simple it was for baby boomers to purchase a home? No, they still had it easy for two major reasons. It's not what you'd expect, but higher interest rates actually help them save money for a deposit in an account that pays 10% interest per year, which helps them reach their savings goal faster. Higher interest rates also ensure that house prices never become too high because the repayments would simply become una for in our previous example where we were looking at interest paid on loans over 2 time periods. The problem with a mortgage is that you have to pay back the principal as well. Paying back the principal on a $430,000 mortgage over a standard 30-year loan term will cost an extra $14,300 per year. The total annual repayment will be just under $36,000. The principal repayment on the 1985 house would be $3,000 per year. Bring the two total repayments to just over $18,000 per year, which is half of what the 2022 home buyer would pay despite 3 times higher interest rates. In other words, if the repayments were kept constant, a person purchasing a home in 1985 could have it paid off in 5 years rather than 30. So, why am I putting so much emphasis on housing? Houses, despite being a vital part of our lives, are also notoriously unproductive. Real estate is an unusual asset class in that it produces nothing of value. A house on a plot of land may appreciate in value and provide a home for its owners or a rental income stream for an investor, but it does not generate any income. Of course, there are other investments today, such as cryptocurrencies, that do not produce anything of value, but their market is minuscule in comparison to the global market for real estate, and it is also irrelevant if the value of Bitcoin rises to $1 million. That's great for the people who invest in it, and it will have some ripple effects in other markets as people cash out to buy whatever crypto millionaires want, but it won't put anyone out on the street. Affordability of housing can accomplish this. It can also stifle the growth of entire economies. Every economy in the world is still, for better or worse, centered on large centers of economic activity, which a layperson might refer to as cities. If real estate in these cities becomes prohibitively expensive, Workers will be unable to hold down jobs there because an increasing portion of their income will be spent on paying rent in the short term. Higher wages can compensate for this. However, these centers are really only for the benefit of the landlords who are fortunate enough to own property there. The money that landlords make from their properties is unlikely to be reinvested in company growth or spent on regular consumer consumption that keeps these businesses afloat. Instead, it is likely to be spent on more property, further driving up market values and the amount of money that is sucked out of productive centers and shoved into unproductive assets. Higher house prices also reduce social and geographical mobility. According to a 2020 Pew Research Center study, 52% of young American adults between the ages of 18 and 28 still live at home with their parents. It is also reasonable to assume that this figure is higher. These young adults are financially bound to where their parents live after 2 years of COVID and record high house price growth. If they are offered a really good job in a different city, they must weigh the pay increase against the increased cost of living on their own. If they decide it is not, they will lose a good job and the company will lose a productive employee. The concentration of wealth in a single generation can have serious consequences for entire economies. And these effects will only become more pronounced as populations age. Japan is a prime example of this, and they do not face the same housing issues that we do in the West. But, in the long run, does this matter? I don't want to be too morbid here, but people die and their wealth is passed down to their children or another beneficiary. As a result, the concentration of wealth in a single generation is, at best, a passing fad. I made an entire video about the Great Wealth Transfer last year, which is the process of baby boomers dying and leaving their wealth behind. The issue we discovered in that video was that a large portion of the wealth being passed down is in the form of private family businesses. The problem is that small businesses frequently require the owner to continue operations, and the people who stand to inherit these businesses are either unwilling or unable to run them. Small businesses are an important part of the economy, and their demise would be disastrous. A ray of hope is that these businesses can be sold by their heirs, who have the necessary skills and desire to run them. Perhaps they'll sell them to people who have enough money to buy the business from their own inheritances. The issue here is the type of people who will receive this money. Most people do not receive money from their parents' deaths until they are quite old themselves. They are frequently nearing the end of their careers or beginning to retire. If the money is passed down to them, they will most likely spend it, fund their own retirements, and then pass whatever remains to their own elderly children. Money pooling in the hands of older people means that younger people will have fewer opportunities to do all of the things that they do to build a functioning economy, such as buying a house, getting a good job, and starting a family, so that there is a constant supply of workers to run an economy. You can't run an economy on people waiting to get old enough to finally do something with their lives. Economists refer to this as the intergenerational wealth problem. I refer to it as the Prince Charles paradox. However, it is something that we will have to address. Wealth and estate taxes are commonly proposed solutions. Even if they did work, they would be extremely unpopular among the massive voting bloc that brought us here in the first place. The final question is whether this is entirely the fault of the baby boomers. I understand that some intergenerational squabbling is fun, but blaming our current economic problems on a single generation is not going to be productive. Voting in your own best interests and enacting policies in the best interests of the majority is the foundation of democracy, and I don't think anyone can argue that this is a bad thing. I believe it is also critical to examine examples of economies where this has not occurred. China, the world's second-largest economy, is an excellent counterexample. Because they spent the majority of their working lives in a dysfunctional economic system, their generational baby boomers are known locally as the lost generation. They were also too old to fully benefit from the rapid economic expansion that occurred in the decades following the economy's opening up, which meant that, despite still constituting a sizable portion of the population, they did not enjoy the same economic prosperity as their Western counterparts. Boomers also benefited from economic prosperity, which was not always under their control. By historical standards, the last half of the 20th century was relatively peaceful. The world also became more open to international trade, and growth was accelerated by an abundance of cheap energy in the form of fossil fuels. It was an excellent time to make a fortune, and many did, which is most likely the final piece of the puzzle. People who become extremely wealthy, such as multimillionaires and billionaires, rarely become impoverished. Again, the clump of billionaires from this generation will skew these figures to make them appear worse than they are. Remember that there are 999 people in a group with one billionaire who are completely broke. The average member of that group is a millionaire, and most billionaires are quite old, so these individuals will have a disproportionate impact on their generational wealth statistics. Again, if we look at billionaires by age in China, a country where the general population does not vote in the traditional sense, we can clearly see that wealth comes from periods of strong economic conditions, not just having the ability to bend public policy to suit yourself and your peers, though I'm sure that helps.